There are places on this earth where time itself seems to freeze, where the wind carries no sound and the snow swallows even the echo of thought. The Alaskan wilderness is one of those places, a kingdom of cold, silence, and endurance. For most, it is a land of beauty best admired from afar, but for a few, it is home. Among those few lived a man named Eli Mercer, a trapper, hunter, and wanderer who had traded the noise of civilization for the stillness of the frontier. He lived in a cabin of his own making, timber he'd felled himself and notched together with patience instead of precision. His world was measured not by hours or days, by weather and hunger, by the crack of ice in the river and the length of the shadow cast by the low Arctic sun. Eli wasn't what anyone would call a rich man. His possessions could fit into 2 packs, one for his traps, another for the tools that kept them working. His rifle, old and patched up more times than count, was his lifeline. It wasn't just for hunting. It was the difference between life and death when the snow turned deep and the game turned scarce. But one winter, one of the cruelest the North had offered in decades, that rifle failed him. A fall on the ice split the stock clean through, and the firing pin, weakened by rust, years of cold, snapped in. He tried to fix it with what little he had, wire, glue, and prayer, but nothing held. A man could survive without many things out there. He could live without light, warmth, or company for a time, but he could not live without his rifle. That night, as the temperature sank below 40 below, I burned faintly green with the northern lights. Eli sat beside the fire staring at the broken weapon across his knees. The flames flickered across the metal, and he saw not the ruin of a tool but a challenge. He had no choice but to make it work. Out here, there were no stores, no shipments, no gunsmiths. There was only what the mountain gave him and what the mountain took away. So, with the patience of a man who had long ago accepted nothing worth having comes easy, he began to build again. The first thing he did was walk to the edge of his old junk pile, a heap of twisted iron, trap parts, nails, and whatever pieces of civilization he'd carried in from the bush over the years. Most of it had no value to anyone but him. There were bent bear traps, broken snowshoe frames, a rusted door, and the skeleton of a snow machine that had died one storm too many. To the untrained eye, it was scrap. To Eli, it was possibility. He picked through it, turning the metal over in his hands, studying shapes, thicknesses, and the way each piece might fit together. He'd been doing this for years, not because he was a tinkerer by nature, but because he had to be. In Alaska, you either learn to make things work or you learn to die quiet. He found what he needed, not in the obvious, but in the overlooked. A fragment of steel from an old snare became the base for a new firing pin. A length of iron from a trap spring was cut down to form the heart of a hammer. He melted and reshaped these parts over the wood stove, the fire hissing as flakes of snow fell through the chimney's cracks. The smell of oil and burning metal filled the cabin, thick and familiar. He worked slow, not because he wanted to, but because the cold forced him to. His hands were wrapped in leather scraps, and even then the frost bit through. Every few minutes he'd stop, blow warmth into his fingers, and start again. The sound of filing, hammering, and quiet cursing blended into the rhythm of the night. By the time the sky began to gray with the weak light of dawn, Eli had a handful of crude but promising parts. They didn't look like much, a tangle of rough metal, uneven and scarred, but he saw in them the outline of something greater. He set to work fitting them together, shaping the barrel with the care of a surgeon, aligning the trigger so it wouldn't slip under pressure. It was trial and error hour after hour, with no guidance except instinct and memory. He had once taken apart a rifle years before, back when he was younger, and still thought he might return to the world someday. That memory became his manual. The stock was another matter. The old one was too far gone, split almost in two. He cut a new one from a plank of pine he'd saved from building repairs, a piece that had dried slowly through 2 summers and had hardened like bone. He carved it by lantern, shaping it not by measure, but by feel. The wood drank in oil as he rubbed it down, its pale grain darkening like river water, turning to dust. The fit wasn't perfect, but neither was anything that had survived out there. When he finally pressed the metal into the new wood, the rifle came together with a kind of rough grace. When he fired it for the first time, the world went still. The echo rolled down the valley like a drumbeat. The bullet struck a frozen birch trunk dead center, the impact snapping bark like kindling. Eli lowered the rifle, examined the chamber, and nodded once. It had worked, not just as well as before, better. The shot was cleaner, the trigger smoother, and the sound had a sharper edge, as though the mountain itself approved. That rifle would become something of a legend in those parts, though no one ever wrote it down. The trappers began to visit Eli's cabin, drawn by word that the man up the ridge could make a gun shoot straighter than factory steel. They brought him old, rusted rifles, boxes of mixed parts, bent barrels salvaged from wrecked camps. They came not because they wanted a perfect weapon, but because they needed something that worked when nothing else did. Eli never asked for money. He traded instead for furs, salt, kerosene, sometimes coffee. His only rule was simple. You worked beside him while he built your rifle. You learned what he did, and in that way, knowledge spread across the valley like the warmth of a shared fire. Within a few seasons, a dozen of those so-called junk rifles were in use across the Yukon Flats. Each one unique, each one shaped by a different pair of hands, and somehow, impossibly, they began to outperform the rifle that came up from the south. The men swore they shot truer, resisted the cold better, and were easier to clean. Some said it was because they'd been built for the cold, not in a factory, but in the same breath of air that froze your beard and cracked your boots. Others said it was because the men who made them believed in them. Belief, after all, is a powerful thing in the wilderness. Eli didn't see himself as an inventor or even a craftsman. He saw himself as a survivor, nothing more. But what he created went beyond survival. Those rifles became a symbol, a certain kind of man, the kind who refused to bow to circumstance, who built with his hands when the world forgot about it. They represented the stubbornness that Alaska demands from anyone who tries to live there. To outsiders, they were crude, ugly things. To those who carried them, they were pieces of themselves. I remember meeting one of those trappers many years later, an old man named Conrad, who had lived through storms that had killed men half his age. He showed me his rifle, built with Eli's help long ago. The metal was worn smooth, the stock patched in oil, but it still fired clean. He said he trusted that rifle more than he trusted most people. I asked him why. He laughed, a short, dry sound that cut through the wind. Because, he said, it was built by a man who didn't give up when everything else broke. And maybe that's the point. Things made in desperation sometimes last longer than things made in comfort. As I think about that story now, sitting far from those mountains, I realize it isn't just about rifle trappers or Alaska. It's about the genius that comes from necessity. When you strip away convenience, when there's no help coming, when you can't call anyone to fix what's broken, you start to see what you're really capable of. Those trappers didn't have factories, schematics, or engineers. They had patience. They had cold hands and hungry nights and a determination that made them find beauty in ruin. There's something deeply human in that. In a world that tells us to replace rather than repair, to buy rather than build, their story feels almost holy. It's a reminder that the greatest tools are not the ones made by machines, but the ones shaped by survival. Each rifle was a statement that failure isn't final, that scarcity can breed brilliance, and that the wilderness, for all its cruelty, rewards those who respect it. And maybe that's why the story of Eli Mercer still echoes across the frozen rivers and through the quiet valleys of Alaska. Because every man who's ever been alone, every person who's ever stared at something broken and thought, maybe I can fix this, understands that feeling. The cold may numb your body, but creation keeps your soul alive. So wherever you're listening from, whether it's a city of noise or a cabin of silence, remember this story, because it's not just about guns or Alaska. It's about what's still possible when all you've got is a pile of junk, two cold hands, and the will to try again. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? The mountains, the coast, somewhere in between? Before Eli Mercer became the man who could turn junk into rifles that sang truer than factory steel, he had been something entirely different. Long before the mountain claimed his silence, he'd walked in cities that never slept, where the cold came from indifference rather than ice. It's strange how life bends a man towards solid, never in one sudden break, but in a series of quiet disappointment, each one pushing him a little further from the noise until there's nothing left but the wind and his own breathing. Eli hadn't been born to the wire. He'd been driven to it step by a world that mistook his patience for weakness and his honesty for stubborn. He'd grown up far to the south, in a town that had once thrived on the lumber trade, but had long since rotted from within. His father had been a mill worker, his mother a woman who spent her life trying to hold together a family that was slowly crumbling under the weight of debts and dreams. Eli learned early that work was a kind of prayer, and silence a kind of shield. As a boy, he had built small things, traps, slingshot, crude toys from scrap wood. He had a way with his hands, a calm that made broken things trust him. But calm has little use in a world built on hurry. When the mill closed, his father turned to drink, and the house filled with a bitterness thicker than smoke. Eli left when he was barely 16. Walking away with nothing but a knife and an old canvas pack. He drifted through jobs the way the wind moves through trees, quietly, without belonging anywhere. For a while, he worked the docks, repairing nets and engines, earning just enough to eat. Then came the oil field, where men shouted, cursed, and bled their paychecks into the bars before dawn. He stayed long enough to learn how machines broke and how men broke fast. What he never learned, how to fit in. Eli wasn't a talker. He'd watch people the way he watched weather, studying them without judgment, predicting when the storm would come. And when it did, he'd simply step aside. He had no taste for conflict, no desire to prove himself to anyone. That alone made him an outsider. So when the chance came to go north, to the edges of Alaska where the maps thinned and the mail came twice a year, if the river didn't freeze too fast, he took it. It wasn't escape, exactly. It was something quieter, a return to a part of himself that the noise of civilization had buried. He started as an assistant trapper, working for a man named Howelson, who'd spent 30 years in the bush. Howelson was rough, mean when drunk, but he knew the land the way priests know Scripture. He taught Eli how to read snow, how to smell storms before they came, how to follow tracks through the timber, even when the light. They worked the lines through winter after, setting steel in silence, hauling furs back to camp by sled. In those years, Eli learned what most men never do, that solitude is not loneliness and silence is not absence. The mountain didn't ignore him. It taught him the language of patience. Patience can't shield a man from loss. One spring, after a thaw came early, the river swelled higher than anyone had seen in decades. The ice broke loose all at once, a wall of white and sound and destruction. Eli and Howelson were camped near the bank, waiting to ferry supplies across when the flood hit. It came in seconds. A roar drowned thought itself. The current tore through their camp, scattering everything. Eli barely made it to a spruce trunk, clutching it as the water rose past his chest. When it finally calmed, the world had changed. Howelson was gone. His sled, his dogs, his gear, all vanished downstream. Eli searched for 3 days, walking the banks until his boots tore open and his voice gave out. He found nothing. No body, no trail, just silence. And in that silence, something in him hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. He rebuilt the camp alone, salvaging what the flood hadn't taken. When he sat by the fire that night, staring at the empty place where Howelson's pack had hung, he understood something most men spend their lives running from. The mountain gives, the mountain takes. It owes no explanation. Stayed, year after year, through winters that broke axes and froze rivers to the bottom, he stayed. The world beyond the valley faded into memory. The hum of cities, the gossip of men, the ache of wanting things he couldn't afford, all that vanished under the endless white. In its place grew something simpler, a rhythm, work, eat, rest, repair, repeat. The days became a kind of meditation. His hands grew strong, his eyes keen. He learned to fix everything that broke because nothing else could be counted on. That skill, born from necessity and isolation, was what would later turn him into a legend among the few who still dared to live out there. But before the legend, there was only the man and the mountain. His first cabin was small, barely large enough for a cot and a stove. The roof leaked until he figured out how to seal it with moss and pitch. The walls were lined with hides to keep out the worst of the wind. He tramped through the coldest months, walking miles each day through snow so deep, swallowed. Sometimes he wouldn't for weeks. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. It was during those years that Eli's fascination with broken things deepened. The wilderness broke everything eventually, tools, traps, even men. But each time something failed, he saw in it a chance to learn. He began to collect discarded scraps from old camps, rusted tin, bent nails, cracked rifle barrels left behind by others. He'd haul them back to his cabin, not because he needed them, because he couldn't stand to see them waste. When storms pinned him in, he'd work by lamplight, filing, shaping, and repurposing. He wasn't trying to build anything grand. He was simply keeping his hands busy, keeping his mind from drifting far into the places where memory could hurt. You see, the truth is, isolation doesn't erase the past. It amplifies it. In the stillness, every regret grows teeth. There were nights when Eli would sit by the fire staring into the coals and think about all the faces he'd left behind. A brother who died young in an accident at the mill. A woman he'd once loved but couldn't afford to keep. A life he might have had if the world had been kinder, or if he'd been willing to fight harder for it. He didn't. He withdrew. That was his way. And out there, surrounded by endless snow, he found a peace that made sense of his choices. Years later, when trappers and travelers began to hear about the man who built rifles from junk, they came not just to trade, but to understand. They'd sit in his cabin, sipping boiled coffee as he worked, and ask him why he'd chosen this life. Eli would usually shrug, as if the question itself didn't make sense. "It's quieter here," he'd say. But sometimes, when the fire burned low and his voice softened, he'd tell them the real reason. "The world talks too much," he'd say. "It promises and forgets. The mountain doesn't promise anything. It just is. And if you respect it, it gives you just enough to keep going." That was Eli's truth. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was returning to something older, something purer. He believed that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he could fix when everything else failed. Maybe that's why the mountain kept him alive when it swallowed so many others. It saw in him the same stubbornness it carried, the same refusal to quit. And so, the man who once wandered the cities of men became part of a quieter, harsher kingdom. The seasons passed, marked not by dates, but by patterns of snow, and the trees grew familiar. The river that had taken his mentor became a mirror he no longer feared. Every scar, every loss, every mistake found a place in that rhythm. The past didn't vanish. It settled into him like sediment at the bottom of a lake. In time, When he began building his first rifle, scraps, that long unspoken history shaped every stroke of his hand. Each file mark, each adjustment carried the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had chosen to keep. It wasn't just metal he was forging. It was memory turned into function, sorrow turned into precision. Maybe that's why his rifles worked better than the ones from factory. They weren't just tools. They were stories you could hold. And so the legend grew from there. The man who went north to disappear, who lost everything and yet built something that lasted. People said he was running from his past. They were wrong. He had simply gone far enough to see it clearly. So, when you hear about Eli Mercer, the trapper who built rifles that outshot the best of them, remember this: his genius didn't come from skill alone. It came from loss, from patience, from a lifetime spent learning how to rebuild what breaks. Out there, under the slow dance of the northern lights, he found what most of us spend our lives searching: a reason to stay, a rhythm that made sense, a silence that told him more truth ever. And if you followed his story this far, maybe you understand why he never came back. Some men are born for the noise of the world. Others are meant to vanish into the wild and become part of something older than time. If you want to hear how his solitude turned into invention, how the silence itself taught him to create, make sure you stay with me. And if you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. There are silences that crush a man, and there are silences that shape him. Eli Mercer had lived long enough to tell the difference. By the time his beard had turned the color of frost and his hands had become maps of old scars, the silence of the mountain had become less a companion and more a mirror. It reflected everything he was: his patience, his temper, his flaws, and his faith. There were no lies in the wilderness. A man could only hide from himself for so long before the stillness caught up to him, peeled back the layers, and left only what was real. And Eli, for all his solitude, was as real as the land he lived on. Each morning began before dawn, when the air was so cold it made his lungs ache. The stove would be down to embers, the cabin wrapped in darkness thick enough to feel. He'd sit up on his cot, rub the stiffness in his knee, and listen to the wind pressing against the walls. It wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it whispered, as if the forest itself was stirring in its sleep. He'd light the lamp, feed the stove, and move through his small home with the same quiet rhythm he'd practiced for years. Every sound, the creak of the floorboard, the rattle of tin, the slow grind of beans, was part of a kind of music known only to men who live alone. He never rushed. Time didn't rule him here. The sun did. When the faint blue of morning crept across the window, he'd step outside, his boots biting into snow that squealed beneath his weight. The air would sting his cheeks, sharp and honest. Smoke from the chimney rose straight up in a frozen column. All around him stretched a kingdom of white and silent. The spruce trees, heavy with frost, bent slightly under their own weight, as if bowing to something unseen. The mountains loomed far beyond, their slopes catching the first light in a wash pink and gold. In that moment, standing there with the rifle across his shoulder and the world holding its breath, Eli felt something close to prayer. Life out there was simple, but never easy. The trap line stretched for miles, a winding frozen river, dense timber, and valley. Even the wolves hesitated. Eli knew every bend, every rise, every place where the ice was treacherous. He walked it daily, sometimes twice, tending to the steel he'd set weeks before. Some days he'd return with fur, lynx, marten, or fox. Other days, with nothing but the satisfaction that the line still held. He didn't measure success by how much he caught, but by how much he endured. The silence along that line was a living thing. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sounds most people hear: the crack of distant ice, the soft whisper of snow falling off a branch, the low murmur of ravens talking in the trees. He'd walk for hours without speaking, and yet his mind was never still. Out there, thoughts had room to breathe. He'd think of small things, how to reinforce the cabin roof before the next thaw, how to fix the sled runner that had started to split, how to make the rifle cleaner. But sometimes his thoughts drifted deeper to questions he never could have asked back in the world. What does a man owe to others? What does he owe to himself? And what is peace really worth? There's a strange kind of freedom that comes when no one is watching you. In the city, a man is always performing, even when he doesn't mean to. Out here, performance was useless. The trees didn't care if he looked tired. The snow didn't care if he was afraid. The river didn't care if he prayed. All that mattered was whether you did the work, whether you prepared before the storm, whether you respected the rules the wilderness demanded. Eli learned that nature has its own sense of justice, harsher, fairer than any court. You take only what you need. You waste nothing. You never turn your back on the cold. Break those laws, and the mountain takes you. When storms came, they came without warning. Walls of white that erased the horizon and turned the familiar trail into a trap. Eli had learned to read the signs, the sudden silence of birds, the shift of light, the taste of the air before snow. He'd hurry back to the cabin, hauling wood inside until it piled high beside the stove. Then he'd wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The wind would howl, the world outside vanishing into a blur. Inside he worked, repairing tools, oiling the rifle, stitching old hides into gloves, or patching his coat. The walls would creak and groan, but he never felt fear. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the storm would end when not be. Patience was his strongest, even in the hardest months. Those long stretches of darkness with sun barely touched the peaks. Eli found small the hiss of water boiling for coffee, the glow of lamp oil reflected in the window, crunch of his boots on fresh snow a blizzard had passed. Sometimes he'd find the tracks of a fox or wolverine crossing his path during the night, and it reminded him that he wasn't truly alone. The land was alive. Everything moved with purpose, even the smallest creature, and he had become part of that rhythm. On rare occasions, other trappers or travelers passed through, usually during the spring thaw when the rivers began to open. They'd trade supplies, share stories, and warm themselves by Eli's fire. He was never a man of many words, but those who met him always spoke of the calm in his voice, the way he listened more than he spoke. They said talking to Eli felt like talking to the land itself, measured, patient, never rushed, most left with something fixed, a rifle mended, a trap repaired, a piece of advice they didn't know they needed. One young man once asked Eli how he managed the loneliness. The boy had just started trapping that season, still new to the cold, still fighting the urge to talk to fill the silence. Eli looked at him for a long moment before answering. "It's not loneliness," he said quietly. "It's life without noise. There's a difference," and that difference defined him. In the silence, Eli found clarity. He learned to read not just the tracks in snow, but the patterns of his own thought. He began to see how often people confuse motion with purpose, how they chase noise to hide from. He realized the world beyond the mountain was always busy being busy. It never seemed to move forward. Here, every action mattered, every decision echoed. If he forgot to check a snare, it stayed empty. If he neglected to patch a leak, he'd freeze. Out there, life didn't forgive distraction. It demanded presence. Sometimes at night, when the fire burned low and the lamp flickered against the log walls, Eli would take out his rifle and clean it, not because it needed it, but because it reminded him of what he was capable of. That weapon, built from scraps or resistance, had become a kind of reflection of his own life, imperfect, scarred, but dependable. He'd run a cloth down the barrel, polish the bolt, check every screw. The ritual calmed him. He'd think about the men who carried his rifles now, scattered across the valleys and ridges, all of them surviving in their own quiet corners. He felt connected to them in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe solitude wasn't the absence of others, but the understanding of what connects you, even when you're... As the years passed, the rhythm of Eli's days didn't change, but something inside him did. The mountain had stripped away everything unnecessary, ambition, regret, fear, until only the essentials remained. He began to see beauty in places he hadn't before. The way frost formed perfect patterns on the window, the brief shimmer of light when the sun, the way silence seemed to hum just before dawn. It wasn't the kind of beauty you could photograph or show someone. It was something you felt in your bones, a slow, deep understanding that life, even in its hardest moments, still... The locals who occasionally passed through the trading post miles away spoke of Eli as a ghost, a man who'd become more myth than flesh. But those who had sat by his fire knew better. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man who had learned to live at the speed in the right. And there's something powerful, something the modern world can't quite understand, because in that silence, Eli had found what so many spend their lives chasing: peace without comfort, meaning without noise, freedom without escape. He didn't need to tell anyone. The mountain knew. The snow knew. The fire that warmed his small cabin knew. And maybe that's all that ever... The years rolled by quietly, the way they do when a man stops. His beard counting them grew longer, his hands slower, but his eyes stayed sharp. He no longer dreamed of the world he left behind. Instead, he dreamed of rivers thawing, the soft crunch of spring snow, of the first geese flying north, their calls echoing through the valley, reminder that life always returned. And in the midst simple, endless cycle, Eli Mercer lived, not as a hermit hiding from life, but as a man who had finally learned to live it on his own terms. It was during the heart of winter, a season so cold even the wolves went silent, that Eli Mercer faced the challenge that would test everything he had learned from the mountain. By then, he had lived nearly 2 decades in solitude. His beard was streaked with white, his eyes weathered but still sharp as cut glass. The world beyond the snow had all but forgotten. Yet, in the wild valleys of Alaska, his name still traveled in whispers carried by smoke of other men's fires. The man who could build rifles from nothing, the man who had outlasted more winters than most, dared to count. But the mountain, as it always does, had one more test waiting, a quiet, merciless kind that arrived not in the form of a storm or a beast, but in the form of time itself. It began with a sound he'd never heard before, a deep, muffled crack that echoed through the valley like the breaking of a bone. He was setting a trap line by the frozen river when it came, rolling under the ice like thunder. The air changed. It had that taste, sharp, metallic, electric. He knew instantly that something was wrong. The temperature had shifted too fast. The early thaw had come weeks ahead of schedule, and the river beneath him was waking up. Eli turned toward the bank, his sled dragging heavy behind him, the dogs draining against the reins. He was still 50 yards from solid ground when the ice beneath him groaned and split. For one heartbeat, the world held still. Then it gave way. The sled lurched. The dogs barked, and Eli plunged into black, freezing water. The cold hit a fist. He fought to surface, clawing against the current, the weight of his coat dragging him down. The ice above was jagged, shifting, breaking apart faster than he could find purchase. He managed to grab hold of a piece thick enough to bear him and heaved himself out, gasping, his breath turning instantly to mist. He lay there, soaked and shaking, listening to the river tear away the rest of his sled. The current swallowed everything, his traps, tools, his food. By the time he crawled to the bank, he had only what was strapped to his back, his knife, a coil of rope, and the rifle he had built from junk years before. The dog, frantic but alive, circled him, whining. The storm clouds were already gathering over the ridge. In Alaska, mistakes are often measured in minutes. He had maybe 30 before his wet clothes froze stiff as bark. He stripped what he could, wrung out the worst of the water, and built a fire from bark and dry twigs he carried in his pouch, a habit that had saved him more than once. The flame caught, hissed, then grew. He fed it slowly, pressing close until the heat bit through his skin. The dogs lay beside him, steam rising from their coats. When the worst of the shivering passed, he began to take stock. The river had taken nearly everything. His food, his extra gear, the spare rifle parts he'd spent months collecting. The nearest supply cabin was over 30 miles away through rough terrain and snow that had started to melt into a treacherous crust. The trail would be slow, dangerous, and cold. He knew he couldn't travel without food for long. The only chance to hunt. That was when the second challenge itself. When he cleaned the rifle by the firelight that night, he found a fine crack along the chamber, a flaw in the steel he hadn't noticed before. The plunge into freezing water must have shocked the metal, turning that old weakness into a fracture. If he fired it as it was, the rifle could explode in his hand. If he didn't fire it at all, he'd starve before reaching the next cabin. It was one of those cruel choices the wilderness offers without mercy. Risk everything now or slowly lose everything later. He stared at the weapon for a long time, tracing the crack with his thumb. It was almost poetic. The thing that had saved him countless times was now as fragile as he was. But Eli wasn't a man to surrender to He had spent half his life fixing what others called hopeless. If he couldn't rebuild this rifle, then everything he'd learned, everything he'd become, meant nothing. The next morning, he began. With nothing more than a knife, a file, and a length of wire from his pack, he set about reforging the rifle as best he could. He used the blade to scrape out the weak metal around the crack, heated it over coals, and reinforced the chamber with a band of steel stripped from an old trap he'd carried in his sled. It was a delicate process. Too much heat, and the metal would warp. Too little, and the bond would fail. His hands moved with the steadiness of someone who knew the cost of haste. The dogs watched him in silence, their eyes reflecting firelight. It took him the better part of a day, and when he finally cooled the rifle in the snow, the sun had already slipped behind the... He loaded a single round and aimed at a tree stump 20 paces away. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his heartbeat. He pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, sharp and strong. The barrel held. The bullet struck dead center. He smiled, just a small thing, barely there, but it was the smile of a man who had once again beaten the odds. Yet the mountain wasn't done with him. That night, as the sky turned clear and the cold returned, one of the dogs began to limp badly, its paw cut in the broken ice. Eli cleaned the wound, wrapped it with a strip of his shirt, and lay awake, listening to the wind scrape across the trees. He knew he couldn't stay there long. The supplies were gone, the river impassable. He would have to travel light and fast if he wanted to make it. For 3 days, he moved through the back country, sleeping under the open sky, eating what little he could snare or shoot. The cold gnawed at him, but he kept going, one foot in front of the other. There were moments crossing frozen ridges, wading through waist-deep snow, when he felt the line between man and landscape blur. He was no longer fighting against the wilderness. He was part of it, moving with it, adapting to every shift of ice and wind. On the 4th day, as he crossed a narrow valley, he saw something that stopped him cold. There, half buried in snow near an old logging trail, lay the remains of a cabin he didn't recognize. The roof had collapsed, the timbers blackened by some long-ago fire. But inside, through the broken doorway, he saw a glint of metal. He stepped closer, careful, his rifle ready. What he found inside was a miracle in its own strange way. A pile of abandoned tools, rusted, still usable, and buried beneath a sheet of an old mechanical. It was as if the mountain itself had left him a gift. He dragged the vise out, thawed it beside a fire, and began with those tools again. Crude as they were, he was able to strengthen the rifle even more. filing, bending, adjusting. He added a reinforcing plate over the stock, reshaped the sights with the precision of a man who no longer doubted his own instincts. When he was done, the weapon looked uglier than ever, but it was stronger than anything he'd built before. The next morning, he tested it again. The shot was clean. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder off stone. It wasn't just the rifle that had survived. It was the man who refused to break. That was the discovery. Not the tool itself, but the realization that his hands, his patience, and his will could turn disaster into invention. That the act of creating, even in the coldest corners of the world, was its own kind of salvation. When Eli finally reached the next supply cabin a week later, starved and covered in frost, the trader there stared at the weapon he carried and shook his head in disbelief. "You made that?" the man asked. Eli just nodded, setting it gently against the wall. The trader lifted it, tested the weight, and muttered, "Feels better balanced than anything I've bought out of Anchorage." Eli only smiled, the faintest glimmer in his tired eyes. "Built itself," he said quietly. "Just needed a man to hold the tool." Word of that journey spread like wildfire among the few who still roamed those. They called it luck, stubbornness, or miracle, each man choosing the explanation that made the most. But Eli knew better. The mountain hadn't spared him to test it, and he had answered with patient craft and courage. That rifle became his last and finest creation, the culmination of every failure, every hardship, every lonely night. It carried within it the proof that even when stripped of everything, a man could still create meaning with his hands and will alone. And for Eli Mercer, that was enough. So when you think of his challenge, don't imagine a man fighting against nature. Imagine a man learning from it, guided not by defiance, but by understanding. That's what made his rifle more than just a weapon. It was the embodiment of his faith in the quiet power of persistence. And if this story has held you so far, if the cold and the silence have followed you through these words, take a moment to stay close for the next part, because what comes after the struggle is the understanding, the reflection that shows what all of this was really for. So, if you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter of Eli's journey is where the meaning begins to unfold. Years passed quietly after the river and the rifle. Seasons rolled over the mountain like slow, unbroken waves, and Eli Mercer moved through them with the patience of a man who no longer measured time by calendars, but by the rhythm of weather, light, and endurance. He grew older, not weaker, but slower, in a way that came not from fatigue, from understanding. His movements became deliberate, thoughtful, free of the haste that consumes men who still believe they are racing toward something. For Eli, the race is long over. The mountain had taught him that all things worth learning are learned slowly, the same way ice forms, layer by layer, unseen until it's solid enough to stand on. There's a kind of wisdom that can only grow in solitude, and Eli carried it in his silence. He had lived long enough to see the world beyond his valley changing in ways that made less and less sense to him. Once a year, sometimes less, a trader or prospector would pass through, bringing rumors and headlines wrapped in weeks-old newspaper. They spoke of machines that could fly faster than sound, of cities lit so bright they drowned out the stars, of wars fought not with rifles, but with buttons screen. Eli would listen quietly, nodding here and there, then go back to his work. Those things belonged to another world, one he had walked away from long ago. He didn't resent it, didn't even envy it. He simply understood that comfort and speed had made men forget the weight of patience. Sometimes, though, when the wind was still and the fire burned low, he would think about the story. He'd picture the people rushing through streets that never slept, eyes fixed on glowing rectangles, hands moving on purpose. He wondered if they ever stopped long enough to hear themselves. He doubted. The modern world, he figured, was full of men who feared silence because Silence told them the truth, and the truth was simple. Most of them had traded freedom for convenience, meaning for comfort. Out here, there was no such trade. Every comfort was earned, every freedom paid for in sweat, frost, endurance. It wasn't that Eli hated the world. He didn't. He just saw it for what it had become, a place where men forgot what they were capable of when stripped of tools and noise. He believed that somewhere deep inside, every man still lived the instinct to build, to fix, to endure, to listen, but that part of them had gone quiet, buried under the hum of engine and the chatter of screen. He often wondered if that was why people admired stories like his, because they reminded them of something ancient, something they'd lost, but still hungered for. The rifle he'd reforged that winter became more than a tool. It was a relic, a symbol of the old world, the kind of world where creation was born from necessity, not ambition. Each time he cleaned it, running his thumb along the repaired barrel, he thought about the lessons that metal carried. The flaw that had nearly killed him had become the strongest part of the gun. That truth stayed with him. He realized that people weren't so different. The things that broke you to ruin you, they could shape you into something stronger, sharper, truer. The mountain had taught him that too. There were days when Eli would sit out the cabin, the rifle resting beside him, and watch the valley breathe. The light would shift across the snow like water, the air so still he could hear the slow ticking of pine needles cracking in the cold. In those moments, he'd feel the strange, humbling weight of being alive in a world that didn't need him. It's a feeling most men would find unbearable, the idea that nature carries on perfectly well with. But Eli found peace in it. To him, that was the point. To live knowing that you are small, but to live well anyway. To be part of the great machinery of wind, snow, and time, not above it. He thought often of Howelson, the old trapper who had vanished into the river all those years ago. Sometimes, in the rustle of the trees, the hiss of snow against the door, he imagined hearing the man's voice again, rough and amused, calling him boy the way he used to. Maybe that was how memory survived out there, not in words or graves, but in the way you carried the lessons forward. Howelson had taught him that nature never lies, and that truth was enough to last a lifetime. But solitude didn't make Eli bitter. If anything, it made him gentle. He learned to see the value in small things, the warmth of a single flame, the weight of a well-made tool, the simple grace of survival done right. He began to understand that life didn't need to be loud to be full. The same way a rifle didn't need to shine to be deadly accurate, a man didn't need attention to live with purpose. Every so often, someone would find their way to his door. Sometimes it was a young trapper. Sometimes a lost hunter, a prospector running from debt. They'd stay for a night, maybe two, always surprised by how quiet the cabin was. Eli would share his coffee, a story or two, then send them off with something repaired, maybe a boot stitched, a lock mended, or a piece of advice they didn't realize they needed. What he never gave them was sympathy. He didn't believe in it. Sympathy, he'd say, was for those who wanted pity instead of strength. Out here, strength was the only currency that mattered. One of those travelers, a young man from Anchorage with hands too soft for the north, asked Eli what kept him here after all these years. You ever notice how still it is before the first snow? Eli asked. The young man nodded. That stillness, Eli said, staring out toward the trees, is what most men spend their lives chasing. They just don't know it. It wasn't the stillness of absence. It was the stillness of understanding, the kind that comes when every part of you finally stops wanting to be somewhere else. That was what the mountain had given him, and that, he believed, was the truest kind of freedom. There was, however, one thing Eli couldn't help but think about as he grew older, the question of legacy, not in the way men think of it now, with their names carved into buildings or printed in books, but in the quieter way, the way work survives in the hands of others. The rifles he'd built were scattered across the wilderness, still used by trappers who didn't even know his name. That was enough for him. He liked the idea that something he had made continued to live, to serve, long after he was gone. It wasn't immortality, but it was something close. As he aged, the work grew slower, but no less steady. His fingers stiffened in the cold, but he still managed to carve, file, and fix. The lamp burned lower now, the wick shorter, but the light was the same. And in that light, the years began to fold together. The boy from the lumber town, the apprentice trapper, the man on the ice, the craftsman by the fire. They were all the same person, each one carrying the same quiet question. What does it mean to live well? He had his answer. Living well, he realized, had nothing to do with wealth or recognition. It was about harmony, about living with enough humility to see that the world owed you nothing, and enough courage to keep building anyway. Sometimes, on clear nights, he'd step outside and look up at the sky. The northern lights would ripple across it like silk, shifting from green to blue to violet. He'd stand there until the cold bit his bones, watching the colors twist and fade. It reminded him that beauty wasn't made to last. It existed for a moment, and that moment was enough. He thought maybe people were like that too. Brief flashes of light and endless sky. What mattered wasn't how long you burned, how true your fire was at last. He would smile, a quiet smile that belonged to a man who, for him, the questions were enough. The work, the mountain, that was his. And perhaps, if there's something for us to take from Eli Mercer's way of living, it's this, that the measure of a man isn't found in what he owns, but in what he endures. That wisdom doesn't come from comfort, but from hardship accepted without bitterness. That solitude isn't an escape, it's a mirror. And if you can look into that mirror without fear, you'll see something most people never do, the face of a man who has made peace with the world. He had no reason to return south, no need to chase the ghost of his past. Everything he had ever needed was here, in the snow, the wood, the slow hum of the wind, even the silence that once threatened to swallow him become a kind of music, a rhythm older than language, teaching him day by day that survival and serenity are two sides of the same coin. And so the world continued without him, and he continued without the world, both moving in their own way, neither missing the other. But sometimes, on those rare clear mornings when the frost clung to the glass, the sun rose like a slow-burning ember, Eli would think of the people beyond the mountains and wonder if they ever felt this kind of peace, or if they were still too busy trying to find it in all the wrong. That was his reflection on the world and the man. That peace isn't something you seek, it's something you build, one piece at a time, out of silence, patience, the will to endure. In the far north, winter never truly ends. It only loosens its grip for a while, letting the rivers breathe and the moss return before the frost claims it all again. For Eli Mercer, that rhythm had become the pulse of his life. He no longer marked years by calendars, but by the feel of each season's arrival, the whisper of thaw in the wind, the sound of ice breaking along the banks, the way the first snow settled like a soft promise that he had survived one more summer. And in that rhythm, Eli had found something unshakable. He no longer fought against the world, no longer chased after meaning. He simply lived within it, like a stone in the riverbed, shaped but unbroken. By the time age had carved deep lines into his face, his hair turned the color of the frost on his window. His hands, once steady as steel, now trembled slightly when he worked. Yet even in that slow fading, there was. The mountain accepted him the same way it accepted the trees that grew crooked from wind, the wolves that limped from old wounds, the rivers that carved new paths when the old ones froze. Out there, imperfection wasn't failure. It was simply The way of the cabin, though weathered by decades of storms, still stood strong. Every beam and board bore his mark. Every tool had been fixed a dozen times, each repair a reminder that endurance wasn't about resistance, but adaptation. The rifle, the one he had reforged from ruin so many winters ago, hung above the hearth. Its metal had dulled with age, but he still cleaned it every week, not because he expected to need it, but because it was part of the rhythm. The act itself, not the purpose, mattered now. Sometimes when the sky cleared and the world turned silver under the moon, Eli would sit outside on a rough-hewn bench, wrapped in his old coat, and listen to the night. He had grown to love that hour, the one between the howl of the last wolf and the first call of the raven. The silence then was absolute, yet never empty. It was full of unseen life, the pulse of the earth, the slow breath of the forest, the crackle of distant frost. That silence was his oldest friend, his truest companion. It had tested him, taught him, stripped him of everything that didn't matter, and given him peace in return. He often thought of what it meant to leave something. Most men believed legacy was measured in what others remembered. Eli thought different. He believed a man's legacy was in the things that continued working after he was gone, the traps that still caught, the rifle that still fired, the cabins that still stood against the wind. Being remembered, it was being useful, was his creed, and he lived it until the end. As the years crept by, fewer travelers came his way. The world beyond the mountains was growing smaller through the wires and engines that connected. The trading post downriver closed. The trails that had once carried men of the wild began to fade back into the snow. One winter, a young pilot in a bush plane passed low over his valley, circling once, twice, before vanishing into the cloud. Eli watched the machine disappear, its sound echoing through the hills like foreign language. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he was the last of his kind. It didn't sadden him. The mountain had no room for nostalgia. Everything that lived here knew it would one day return to the earth, and Eli was no different. Still, he decided to prepare, not for death exactly, but for absence. He began to set his things in order, oiling every tool, sharpening every blade, patching the cabin roof one last time before the snow came. He stacked firewood high, enough to last another winter. Even if he didn't, he cleaned the rifle, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it gently beside the table. In the evenings, he wrote small notes on scraps of paper, instructions for whoever might find his home someday, how to light the stove without smoking the chimney, where to find dry moss for the lamp, which traps worked best near the river bend. He signed none of them. They weren't for glory. They were a gift, quiet and simple, from one survivor to another. When the first snow returned that year, heavier and earlier than expected, Eli felt something different in his bones. The cold settled deeper, the way it does when the body starts. He didn't resist it. He wrapped himself in blankets, drank his coffee black, and watched the flakes fall past the window like memories dissolving into air. Each one was unique, and yet all of them vanished. One morning, as the sun rose weakly behind a veil of clouds, Eli walked down to the river. The dogs were gone now, years since buried on the hill behind the cabin, their collars still hanging by the door. The river had frozen smooth and silent, the same one that had once tried to take his life. He knelt beside it, pressed a hand to the ice, smiled. "You won that round," he whispered, his voice hoarse with age. But I stayed. He stood there for a long while, watching the horizon shift in pale gold. Then he turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire was still burning low, the stove humming softly. He added another log, warmed his hands, and sat in his chair by the window. He looked around the small room, the tools, the hides, the walls darkened by smoke and years, and realized that everything in it told a story, his story, and not one word of it needed to be spoken. The fire burned slower, the silence deepened, but it no longer pressed on him like it had when he was young. It cradled him instead, soft and familiar. On the last night of his life, the northern lights returned, a cascade of green and blue waves rippling across the sky. He saw them from his chair. Through the frost-lined window, they moved the way memory moves, bright, fleeting, eternal. He smiled once more, closed his eyes, and let the silence take him home. When the thaw came months later, a pair of trappers passing through found his cabin. They knew of Eli Mercer. Everyone in the valley had heard of the man who built rifles from junk and lived longer than the mountain itself. They entered quietly, hats in hand, as if stepping into a church. The fire had long gone out, but everything was in its place. His tools gleamed with oil. His chair sat by the window. The rifle lay wrapped in cloth beside the table, untouched. On the wall, a note written in a steady hand read, "If you've come this far, you already know what to do. Take what you need, fix what you can, leave the rest better than you found it." The men buried him on the hill beside the dogs, under a cairn of stones overlooking the river. They marked it, not with a cross, but with the barrel of a broken rifle, one of the kind Eli had once turned into something greater. Then they sat for a while, smoking, and because words felt too small for the kind of life he had lived. Years passed, and the cabin stood through storm after storm. Travelers still found it sometimes, drawn by rumor or accident. They always said the same thing, peaceful inside, as if the place itself was still alive. Some swore they could hear faint sounds at night, slow scrape of steel, the echo of a man still working by lamplight. They'd laugh, but none stayed long. The mountain doesn't keep company for more than a night. The rifle, though, endured. One of those trappers took it with him, passing it down to his son and then his grandson. Over the decades, it changed hands many times, moving from valley to valley. No one remembered where it came from, but every man who held it said the same thing. It shot straighter than it had any right to, and it never failed in the cold. Some swore that the metal itself held warmth, as if the spirit of the man who made it still burned inside. And so Eli Mercer's legacy lived on, not in stories written or names remembered, but in something that worked, something built with care and truth. His silence had not been wasted. It had become part of the world, hidden in steel and wood and snow, teaching the same lessons he had learned, that nothing is truly useless if you're patient enough to see what it can become, and that peace is not found in noise or comfort, but in the steady rhythm of doing one thing well until the end. If there's a message in his life, it's this: a man doesn't need to be seen to make a mark. He only needs to leave something that lasts, a story that can be felt even when no one remembers the name behind it. Eli's story isn't about a rifle or a mountain. It's about what happens when a man listens to the silence long enough to hear himself. And if you've reached this far, maybe that silence is reaching you too, that pull toward something older, truer, simpler. So wherever you are, in the city, on the road, or under your own quiet, take a moment to sit in it. Listen, because the mountain never really leaves those who learn from it. Its lessons stay, like echoes in the wind, waiting for anyone patient enough to hear. And if Eli's story spoke to something in you, share it. Tell someone about the man who built a rifle from junk and found peace cold. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, what part of the world you call your mountain. If his silence reached you, let it. Like all good stories, it's meant to keep traveling from one firelight to another, one quiet heart to the next.